Elias Ward never thought his life would lead him to such a role. He was a man of quiet manner, known more for his books than for any act of bravery. His work as a historian had earned him a reputation for being fair. He wrote about moments of war and peace, about the rise and fall of nations. He tried not to judge too harshly in his writings, only to lay things as they were. This was why he was chosen. Others had sharper tongues, others had more fame, but Elias had the cold patience of one who searched for truth. The council that ruled across the stars did not want passion in their observer. They did not want someone who would be swayed by tears or anger. They wanted Elias, who they believed would look down on earth and make a simple mark, worthy or unworthy. Humanity was to be measured as if it were an experiment placed in a glass bowl. Many expected an easy answer. Humanity had been through wars, bloodshed, greed, power struggles, and endless rivalries. To many, they were a dangerous race, one best kept away. Should have been a simple dismissal. Elias accepted the task because he believed in seeing things close. He thought if he were to judge a people, even his own, he should walk through their shadows and their light. He was placed in a vessel high above earth. The vessel was silent, unseen, able to move quick and vanish as if rising into fog. From there he began his watch, his pen ready, his eyes sharp, but his heart steady. Or at least that was how it began. The first days were filled with sight and sound that wrote themselves into his notes. He saw cities alive with neon towers and small towns covered in the calm of green fields. He saw the old farmland where sons and daughters worked the soil and cared for it, as their parents had done. He also saw vast factories blaze smoke into the sky, lines of workers bent and tired. He saw wealth sparkle in tall glass buildings, and he saw hunger walk the streets below them. It was a world of deep contrast. On the second week of his watch, a storm shattered the sky over the ocean and made its way across coasts lined with fragile homes. He saw a young woman, Maria Lopez, wading knee-deep in rising water to pull her grandmother to higher ground. Her thin body straining, but her grip never loosening. He saw a man, William Hayes, guiding frightened children from a collapsing shelter. His face set with fear, but his steps sure. These acts of courage spread like light across the storm. They were small, yet when seen from far above, they glowed brighter than any fire. But there was darkness too, and Elias did not look away from it. He saw men fighting in the ruined markets of a once great city. He saw knives, fists, fire, and eyes wide with rage. He heard the cries of the wounded through the echo of his machines. He marked it down as truth, for humanity always carried the mark of violence. Each night, when earth turned in silence and the lights of towns flashed back through the dark, Elias thought of the task before him. What he saw could be made into proof that humans were hopeless, that they would never rise above their hunger and chaos. Yet the same days also gave proof of hands held out in kindness, of bravery that asked for no reward. Elias wondered if truth could ever be as clean as the council believed. He began to see that his duty was heavier than it first seemed. Watching Earth was not like opening a book of history. It was like listening to a heartbeat. It was fragile one moment and thunderous the next. Humanity stood at the edge, broken yet alive, fierce yet tender. Elias told himself that he would keep steady, but each scene he wrote down left a mark not only on the page but on his own heart. It was only the beginning, yet he already feared that no judgment could ever capture the whole of them. Elias woke with the sound of distant thunder carried up from the world below. His vessel recorded every detail, every sound, every echo of chaos, but he preferred to hear it himself. It made him feel less like a watcher of numbers and more like a listener to lives. That morning, he turned his eyes to the ruins of a city that once shone with towers of glass. The city now stood in broken walls and roofless streets, yet in those ruins, life still moved like a stubborn flame that refused to fade. There he found his attention caught by Commander Aaron Blake. Aaron was not a man of wealth or high birth, yet people followed him as if he had been born their leader. He wore an old jacket torn from battle, its sleeves scarred with smoke, and his voice carried hope even when his eyes revealed exhaustion. Elias watched Aaron lead survivors through flooded streets, making sure the youngest were carried on higher ground, making sure no one was left behind. Sometimes Aaron would laugh in dark moments just to remind the others that joy had not been stolen from them. He spoke with firmness, Yet he held his men not with fear, but with trust. Elias made careful notes, writing down each moment to keep truth alive. Far to the south, on shores where the ocean kept pushing against the land, another figure caught Elias in thought. Queen Isabella had been urged by her council to flee when the waters kept rising. Entire towns were swallowed in days, the sea flooding through walls as if it sought to remind humans of their weakness. Yet Isabella stayed. She stood dressed not in elegance, but in steel, her crown exchanged for a soldier's helm. She waded ankle-deep in bitter water alongside her soldiers, her hands raw from lifting sandbags, lifting beams, lifting the people who trusted her. Even in exhaustion, she did not step aside. Her vow to remain by the people gave them strength, and that strength spread far beyond her own hands. Elias saw in her not the distant figure of royalty, but the clear shape of human defiance against despair. The ruins of the world offered Elias every shade of human struggle. On the edge of broken plains, he saw scavengers turn desperate, raiding villages and leaving fire in their wake. He noted their cruelty, but also their fear. Yet in one of these villages stood Alina Brooks. She had once been a soldier, her scars plain and unhidden, but she held the memory of discipline and turned it to defend her people. She gathered farmers and workers, people unfamiliar with battle, and she taught them how to hold the line, how to stand against fire, not with hate but with duty. Her militia was not meant to conquer but to guard, and though their weapons were few, their spirit stood unbroken. Elias marked down her name, and for a long time he stared at the page before moving on. As weeks passed, Elias began to see not single events but patterns forming. Humanity was split, yet again and again he saw the same stubborn refusal to vanish. Fire consumed homes, storms tore apart fields, raiders spilled blood on stone, yet each time someone stood up, they stood though their hands shook, they stood though their eyes carried fear. And those who stood were followed, not because people were ordered, but because hearts clung to any sign of hope. At night, Elias found his hands trembling when he read back his notes. He wanted to keep his style plain, to write what he saw, yet his pen seemed to lift with weight each time he wrote of courage. He told himself he should not care, that judgment must be free of care or bias. But the truth was sinking into him, and it was harder with each day to treat it like numbers or records. When the storms cleared and fires cooled, Elias looked at Earth, turning once more. He saw not a broken world, but a stage in which countless small stories burned with meaning. In every fight and every act of mercy, he saw proof that words like despair were only half the truth. Humans did not simply end when struck down. They rose again. And it was this simple fact that began to trouble Elias most of all, for it meant his judgment would never be as easy as the council hoped. Elias had now spent many weeks in silent watch, and with each passing day, his thoughts grew heavier. The notes he had written no longer looked like a cold record. They looked like the living map of a people who refused to give up. He had been told that his duty was simple. He had been told that humanity's story was already written in blood and greed. But every time he believed he had found proof of their darkness, he also found a light that broke through it. The council demanded his first report. They wanted him to send back a list of crimes, wars, cruelty, division, and selfish desire. And Elias could have done so easily. He had seen much of it with his own eyes. On one day, he recorded smugglers looting a convoy and leaving mothers begging in the dust. On another, he marked down how rivals in a ruined city fought over scraps of food while children cried at their feet.
Ow.
Those moments showed the cruelty that people spoke of when they said humanity was beyond saving. But then there were days when the evidence did not fit the simple answer. Elias watched as Daniel Cross, once a thief and smuggler, stood before his men and spoke of change. Daniel had lived from crime, but now he turned his eyes toward the weak who could not defend themselves. Elias saw him lead his gang not to rob but to guard, not to break but to protect. Like a convoys that once feared him now followed the carts under his care. One choice, one man, had shifted the path of many others. Elias wrote this carefully, his hand still as if he feared his own belief. Alina Brooks, whose militia guarded farmland with little more than broken rifles and firm voices, gave him more to think about. She had seen war when she was young, and had no wish to see it rule her home again. Yet the war reached her at every turn. Raiders came at night, strong and merciless, but her people stood their ground. Elias saw one of her soldiers fall, only for two farmers to lift the weapon and push the attackers back. These were not born fighters. They were mothers, sons, and old men who refused to surrender what little they had. Mark down each name he could record, knowing that history should not lose them. Queen Isabella stood as another riddle for him. Royal titles often brought comfort and safety to those who carried them, but she rejected both. He saw her once at dawn, standing atop a broken wall with her blade in one hand and a torch in the other. Around her, people slept, hungry yet calm, because they trusted she remained awake for them. She was not perfect, and Elias noted her mistakes with honesty. Yet the truth was clear. Her people believed in her because she bled with them, and that bond was stronger than walls. The more Elias collected, the more he feared the question that rested in his heart. Was humanity flawed beyond repair? Or was humanity stronger because of its struggle? They carried war like a disease. Yet from that same curse grew healing hands. They built weapons that could destroy, yet they also built bridges of mercy after the worst fights. They stumbled again and again, yet rose with the look of those who would not stay silent. Elias knew the council wanted only one truth. They wanted a line drawn, worthy or unworthy. But each night, when earth turned below him and he read the story he was writing, he could not find the courage to send it. His duty was simple, yet the truth before him was not simple at all. For every cruel act that filled a page with despair, another act of courage forced him to turn the page and write again. Elias told himself he was only an observer, but already his own heart was too deeply tied to the fate of those he was meant to judge. Elias could no longer remain only as an eye in the sky. The council grew restless with his silence and sent orders that he meet humanity face to face. They wanted him to look into the eyes of those he judged, to see them not as shadows, but as witnesses to their own fate. He knew that this moment could not be delayed. If he stepped on the ground, his duty would rise from distant notes into living proof. If he denied, the council would take the task from him and place it in the hands of someone else, someone who might never look for the light that Elias had found. So he descended quietly and stood upon the surface of earth. He chose no palace, no seat of power, but the ruins of an old capital where leaders gathered in broken halls to speak of survival. The city was scarred with fire and holes from past battles. Walls leaned as if one strong wind could bring them down, yet inside sat men and women with voices sharp as steel. Aaron Blake stood among them with his jacket torn yet his spirit unshaken. Queen Isabella wore armor that had marks of both war and water, yet her presence carried the strength of 100 men. Lena Brooks stood with dirt still on her face from the fields she had protected. Her rifle across her shoulder not as a weapon of pride, but as proof of her resolve. Elias did not declare himself as their judge. He joined them as a messenger, asking not for power, but for truth. He asked them what kind of future they hoped to build when their past was filled with war and ruin. The question itself ignited sparks among the leaders. Some spoke with bitterness, saying peace was a dream too far for them, that survival itself was enough. Others answered with fire in their tongues, claiming that even in brokenness they must rise as one. The debate grew into shouts, and Elias felt the weight of their anger and fear. It was not an easy gathering. Humanity never chose the simple road. The voices ceased not because of agreement, but because of danger. Raiders who had watched the hall from the shadows surged forth with weapons, screaming with hunger for power and chaos. In the chaos that followed, Elias saw more than words. He saw the truth of what humanity was in their rawest form. Aaron Blake did not retreat. He threw himself to the front, shielding those without weapons, his commands ringing through gunfire. He stood as both wall and sword. Queen Isabella did not hide. She drew her blade and moved beside her soldiers, striking not as a figure of royalty, but as a fighter who refused to let her people fall. Elena Brooks spread her militia fast, forming a shield for civilians, KDing mothers and children to safety with movements quick and sure. It was no polished battle. It was raw, frantic, and filled with screams. Elias stood frozen for a short time, his pen forgotten. Yet his eyes could not look away. What he witnessed was not unity shaped by rules, but unity shaped by choice. They could have fled, they could have blamed each other, but they stood shoulder to shoulder. Violence tested them with sharp claws, and from their wounds rose courage that would not bend. When the raiders were broken, and the hall stood again in tense silence. Elias held his breath. The leaders gathered once more, bodies bruised, clothes torn, yet their eyes held a strange fire. In the clash of violence, something had been proven without words. Humanity might fight itself, might tear itself in rage, but when faced with a storm from outside, they rose together. He saw that strength clearly, and it both stirred his heart and filled him with deep fear. That night Elias returned to his chamber, his hands restless as if his very skin held the memory of what he had seen. He had asked them what future they would choose, and when the test came, they had given their answer not in speeches, but in defiance. They had chosen to resist as one, no matter how divided they seemed before. It was not perfect, it was not clean, but it was true. And in that truth, Elias saw what the council could not yet understand. Humanity's worth was not in being pure. It was in their refusal to stay broken. Elias sat alone in the quiet of his chamber, his notes spread across the table before him. Day after day he had written without pause, trying to capture every act, every struggle, every choice he had witnessed. Now the time had come to send his report across the far distance. The council would expect a single clear judgment. They wanted him to measure humanity with one word, to mark them as fit to belong or destined to be forgotten. Yet as Elias stared at his pages, he felt the task slipping further from reach. His heart carried weight that no single mark could release. He thought of Aaron Blake standing firm in the rubble, his laughter holding back despair even when his body trembled with exhaustion. He thought of Queen Isabella in the floodwaters, her blade lifted high, while her people clung to hope at the sound of her voice. He thought of Alina Brooks shaping frightened farmers into guardians, who stood firm even in the face of raiders stronger than them. He thought of Daniel Cross turning from crime toward the role of protector, guiding once faithless men into defenders of the weak. Each name he wrote had become more than a story. They were colors of one picture, a picture that could not be painted in black or white. The council had wanted proof of failure, and Elias could easily give it if he chose. War still burned across lands, hunger and greed still tore through the hearts of men. Jealousy and violence spread like rot in places of power. Yet at the same time he had seen devotion that no order could erase, courage that rose from the smallest hands, and fire in the will of people who refused to stay down even when all seemed lost. His report could be filled with shame or filled with pride, but neither answer would ever contain the whole. He began to write at last, his hands slow but steady. He did not call them unworthy, and he did not praise them as saints. Instead, he wrote of their storms, of their fire, of their refusal to vanish even when the world struck them again and again. He told of leaders who bled beside their people and strangers who risked themselves for children not their own. He warned that this race was unlike those who bent or broke under chains. Humanity did not bend. Humanity refused to die. As the final words filled the page, Elias knew why fear gripped him. If the council ever tried to tame or chain such a people, they would find themselves standing against a storm that no hand could hold back. Humanity was fierce not because they were without flaw, but because their flaws turned into strength. Every wound came a lesson. Every wound became fuel to rise higher. Even in the depths of ruin, they found a reason to fight, and in that struggle they forged a new will to endure. Elias set his pen down and stared into the dark above the turning earth. He whispered a prayer that the council would never return to this place. For if they came with hope of ruling, they would be crushed by a force they could not understand. And if they came with fire in their eyes for war, then humanity would meet them with fire 100 times greater. The report he sent was no judgment of numbers. It was a warning. He begged the council to keep their distance, for what he had seen could not be measured or contained. Humanity was not a puzzle to be solved, nor a flock to be guided. They were a storm draped in human form, a fire that found fuel even in ashes. As Earth continued to turn with its scars and its light, Elias placed his hands together and prayed. He prayed that they would remain free from hands that sought to measure them. He prayed that their strength, dangerous as it was, would stay their own. And most of all, he prayed that the council would never return. For the day they did would be the day they uncovered the full truth of humanity, and by then it would be far too late.